Hello everybody, welcome back to C&S Corvettes in Sarasota, Florida. It's your Corvette buddy Lyle here to talk to you about more interesting, exciting, and hopefully helpful Corvette stuff. Today we're going to be covering one of my favorite topics, which is the C5 Corvette. Specifically, the 5 reasons that the C5 Corvette is still relevant and desirable almost 30 years after its introduction. Let's get into it. So, if you guys watch this channel regularly, it's probably not lost on you that the C5 Corvette holds a special place in my heart. It is kind of the best of all worlds, in my opinion, as far as, cost to attain one, cost to maintain one, and the benefits of owning versus the ownership experience and all that. It's really a sweet spot with the C5, in my personal opinion. And I was sitting at my desk the other day and I'm like, it's going to be 2025. I mean, that means that the 97s are 28 years old now. 28 years. What's crazy is with what we do, and as long as we've been doing it, we still consider the C5 a relatively new Corvette. And I mean, 28 years. It's hard to believe. But I started thinking about, at the 28-year mark, what makes the C5 still so popular, so relevant, and why do you still see them everywhere? Why are people still driving them actively and enjoying them? So this is just based on my opinion and my experience, but here are the 5 reasons that I believe that the C5 is still the rock star that it is. Number 1, reliability. High-performance sports cars tend to be fussy and finicky. The Corvette has always been a little bit better about that because it was usually built not using exotic stuff, and it was usually built to last. The C5 is no exception. The LS engine, from the LS1 all the way through the LS3, were really outstanding as far as, just being great engines. It's not unheard of to get 250,000, 300,000 miles out of an LS engine as long as it is properly maintained. And they're not overly heavy engines. They're quite light. They're torquey. They give you a good, reliable power band. And it's usable in a lot of different situations. The suspension bushings. Now, that you're like, suspension bushings, Lyle, what do you mean? Well, okay, let's think about the C2, the C3, the C4 Corvettes. The rubber bushings they had all throughout the suspension in those cars would crinkle up and kind of die after a decade, 12 years, 15 years, whatever, and you have to go through and replace them all. I mean, we're talking, I see C5s in here all the time, like mine, that's, 22 years old now and has 260,000 miles on it. The bushings look like new. I don't know, I'd love to know specifically what they changed in the rubber compound they use in those bushings, but by and large, the bushings in the suspensions on the C5s and the C6s look like the day they were made years and years, decades later, which is nice. The transmissions and the differential, the other parts of the drivetrain, all last really well with proper care. Now, by proper care, I mean is not outright abuse and making sure that fluids and filters and gaskets and leaks are all tended to. So again, the entire drivetrain, we always joke that, the C5, there's some really chintzy and cheap stuff in the interior, but they really did spend their money on the drivetrain on that car. I think one of the other things that has helped with the C5 reliability is that it had those hydroformed frame rails. The chassis on the C5 was far stiffer than anything that had come before. That's why you have a clip-in Targa roof instead of a screw-in Targa roof like you did with the C4. And as the C4 coupes aged, that chassis flex would get worse and worse as that chassis got tired. You don't see that with the hydroform framed rails on the C5. That chassis, the frame itself, is as stiff today as it was 30 years ago. And that gives you that nice solid platform where a car feels like it's of a piece. And most GM products built that long ago didn't feel that way when they were 2 years old, much less 20. Number 2, styling. If you look at the C4 and then you look at the C6, they both have harder edges, more wedge-shaped, more sharp. The C5 was really a departure from that with the more rounded lines, kind of, more humps than angles, if that makes sense. And I think that particular body style has aged really well because while it wasn't like world-changing as far as styling goes, it is benign enough where it just kind of slides through the decades and still looks good. I think that the early base C6s and the C4s definitely look like they are older cars, where in my opinion, the C5 is still very relevant style-wise because there was nothing offensive about it. It was just what it was. The simple interior, which everybody, including me, whined about how cheap the interior was back in the day. And we know the reasons why it was. But 28 years later, now it's kind of like analog retro. Like, well, there are no screens. It's knobs and buttons. And there's no CarPlay. There's no this, there's no that. It is very much now kind of a cool throwback to when cars were meant for driving and nothing else. And I think that has actually become kind of cool. And I've heard a lot of the younger people, like Andy, our young tech here who has a C5, he loves the fact that it is just a very simple, driver-focused, driving experience-focused interior. And I agree. And I think that is actually one of the things that people have come to love about that car. I keep going like this because I'm actually looking at Steve's blue Sebring Z06 over here that you've seen in other videos, and I keep referencing that car, so that's where my eyes are going. The wide stance of the C5 really set it apart from other cars on the road when it was introduced in 1997. I mean, it had considerably wider than the C4, looked much more like something that was more exotic as far as dimensions go. And even in traffic today, you see a C5 coming, it's low, it's wide, it looks cool. It's not just another car on the road. Oddly enough, I've actually been reading articles in the last 6 to 8 months where people are loving the fact that they still have pop-up headlights. Now, for a long time, pop-up headlights were, oh man, it's so 70s and 80s. Oh man, no. Yeah, well now, it's one of the only cars left out there that still has pop-up headlights that's still on the road regularly, and people are digging it, especially with things like the sleepy eye conversion and the way of modernizing the look of those pop-up headlights. You can do some really cool stuff, and it keeps that car unique in its entire spectrum. Reason number 3 that the C5 is still relevant: drivability. Unlike Corvettes of the past, where you had to sacrifice comfort or fuel mileage or storage space or ease of ingress and egress or whatever, the C5 gave you all those things. It had excellent fuel mileage. It had outstanding handling for the price point. I mean, specifically the C5 Z06 was outhandled just about everything else that was produced in 2001 and 2002 at almost any price. The comfortable, roomy interior. Again, we know it's kind of chintzy, which is now kind of cool, but I, as you guys probably know, I'm 6'11", and I fit more or less comfortably in a C5. And there's no other Corvette that I can really say that about except for the C8, which is obviously in a different price range. Luggage space in the C5, whether it's the coupe, the convertible, or the fixed roof coupe, luggage space was really good. I mean, you can pack, my son has packed my Z06 full with everything we need to go do a racing weekend at Sebring. My luggage, his race stuff, waters, a cooler, blah, 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 and still had room for 2 of us in it. I don't know how he did it, but he did it. I think too that the drivability, we go back to the LS engine on what makes that car so special. It is so happy to be at just about any rev range at any speed. And if you just want to cruise along with your hand up on the steering wheel, great. If you want to go back and curve up the twisties, that's awesome too. The drivability factor keeps this car relevant because there are very few cars that are going to give you the experience this car does for the price. Reason number 4 that the C5 is still relevant, it's a great value. And you're going, well, Lyle, come on, man. I mean, is it really? Yeah, it definitely is. Here's why. Very few sports cars from the late 90s and early 2000s can compete with this at all. I don't care what demographic you're looking at, what metric you're using to measure it. The C5 was an extremely competent car for its time, and in its current price range, it is still one of the most competent cars you can buy. Relatively low maintenance. Now, let me caveat that. As these cars age, 20, 30 years old, they're going to need maintenance. They're going to need the harmonic balancer, the torque tube, a clutch, the AC is going to go out, all the things that an older car is going to need. But thankfully, almost all of that stuff, other than a few pieces of electronics, are completely available for this car. And they're not stupid money. It's not like trying to maintain a late 90s Porsche or a late 90s Ferrari or, anything Italian. So it is something that's very attainable for the normal working person to maintain one of these cars, as long as they understand that there are going to be expenses. But overall, you get in it, you turn the key, and you go. And what's better than a sports car that you can count on? Really nothing. They're also very easy to upgrade and modify. I mean, there is a ton of aftermarket stuff. You want more power? No problem. You want aero? No problem. You want cool wheels, aftermarket body kits, LED lighting, any of that. You've got a buffet of things to choose from for this car, and you can make it exactly the way you want it. That's pretty cool. And, the large aftermarket support for actual necessary things like fuel pumps and stuff like that, they're all made by multiple companies. So these cars aren't going to become lawn ornaments anytime soon, because the aftermarket support is there, and there's enough of these still on the road to warrant the continued production of those parts. Finally, number 5, and my personal favorite, why the C5 is still relevant, it's flexibility. No, I'm not talking about the chassis. The chassis is really rigid. What I'm talking about is, continuing on a little bit with the theme of modifications and upgrades, you can take a C5 and make it just about anything you want it to be. Do you want to build a track day car? No problem. Put the half cage in it, put racing seats in it, take a bunch of stuff out of it that you don't need to lighten it up, put some better brakes on it, better wheels and tires, a little bit of aero, some extra cooling. You got a track car, done. You want a drag racer? Sure, no problem. You just set it up differently, doing the same thing. An endurance racing car. I've just started now to see some of these C5s show up in the endurance racing, the grassroots level endurance racing that my son competes in. And they're super competent. In fact, in at least one of the leagues, they won't even allow them out there because they're too good. What's that tell you? Now, this isn't my thing, but I know a lot of people, younger people, are turning these into drift cars. It's a super easy car to change over into a drift monster. And that's a lot of young people are really doing that, and that's awesome. But away from the performance aspect of things, if you want a car that you want to drive Route 66 on, do 3,200 miles in, C5's a perfect choice. Comfortable, good fuel mileage, good AC, plenty of storage. It can also be a Sunday cruiser where you just take it to the golf course or to the beach and wave at people as you drive by. Or it can be a daily driver. And in Florida here, where we are, a lot of people use Corvettes every day. Some of my customers, it's their only car, and it's always either a C5 or a C6 because they are so flexible. They can be whatever you want them to be. They're a wonderful canvas to build whatever picture you want on them. And yeah, those are the 5 reasons that I still believe that the C5 is as relevant, if not more, than it was when it was new. And it is one of the best values out there for a car that is iconic, reliable, and fun. And fun is the most important. That's why we own these cars. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have other ideas about why the C5 is still so good, put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And, well, yeah, that's it. You guys take care. Thank you so much.